Alright folks, let's talk about what you need to study for your unit test on plants and fungi. In your VIP section, we have two foldables from this unit. You have your fungi foldable and your plants foldable. Additionally, you might find the kingdom chart from our classification unit to be really helpful in comparing fungi and plants in chart form as well as on the Venn diagrams on the back. In your labs and projects section, you have our plants and fungi introductory web quest, and you also have this data sheet for the plant and fungi labs, which due to the snow days might have been shortened in your class. So you might not have gotten to every part of this, but the part that you did get to with your class will be useful to study. As always, you can study your unit portfolio and your glossary to get ready for this test. In terms of online resources, I have several Quizlets made that will help you review these terms as well as these structures. Many of them have pictures to help you really understand the material. You'll also be able to find full copies of the notes and video links to this video as well as other helpful review videos as you study. Let's start by talking about fungi. Organisms in the kingdom fungi are part of the domain Eukarya. This means that all of their cells are eukaryotic, containing a nucleus and membrane-bound organelles. Fungi are heterotrophs, meaning that they cannot make their own food, and the role that they play in the ecosystem is usually that of the decomposer, although sometimes they can be parasites to a host. As decomposers, fungi help break down dead matter and return it to the cycles of nature. Fungi can reproduce using asexual reproduction or sexual reproduction. There are some species of each. Fungi can also be unicellular or multicellular. It depends on the species. Fungi get their energy through a process called external digestion. This means they grow on what they eat. They secrete digestive juices and then absorb the digested material back into their cells. If you see a fungus growing perhaps on a dead log or maybe on a slice of bread, that means that it's eating those things. We learned about several types of fungi. One kind we learned about is thread-like fungi. Thread-like fungi are mostly parasitic, and perhaps the most famous example would be bread mold. Sac fungi is the most diverse group of fungus. They are called sac fungi because their reproductive structures are stored in little pouches. Club fungi are perhaps the most famous kinds of fungi. These include fungi like mushrooms. A club fungus is definitely more than meets the eye. The part of the club fungus that you see above ground, the stipe, and the cap, is actually just the reproductive structure of a fungus. Even more of it resides underground. Underground is a huge network of thread-like structures called hyphae, together forming a mycelium. This collection of hyphae allows the fungus to grow. The part that's above ground is just the reproductive structure. Imperfect fungi are fungi that don't really fit into the other categories of thread-like, club, and sac fungi. Examples of imperfect fungi include parasites, such as the fungus that causes athlete's foot, and incredibly helpful fungi, such as Penicillium notatum, which makes a very helpful antibiotic called penicillin. Another interesting aspect of fungi is that of lichen. Lichen is not a fungus by itself, but it's actually a symbiotic relationship between an algae, which is a protist, and a fungus. Because this symbiotic relationship benefits both the algae and the fungus, it's called mutualism, because both parties benefit. What happens is the algae does photosynthesis and helps feed the fungus, while the fungus provides structure for the algae and prevents it from dehydrating. You'll often see lichen growing on rock, and it's a great indicator of air quality. We discussed several ways that fungi reproduce. Let's first talk about ways that fungi can asexually reproduce. In the process of fragmentation, the hyphae or mycelium break apart and can grow into two identical organisms. In the process of budding, which is used by yeasts, one organism breaks off smaller parts to create identical clones. Other fungi asexually reproduce by releasing spores. Spores are like little escape pods that can help the fungus propagate its genes when times are hard. Spores can travel long distances when carried by wind or in or on other organisms. When they land in favorable circumstances, they can grow into a genetically identical organism. Fungi can also reproduce sexually. Like we mentioned before, club fungi contain their reproductive structures in the parts of the fungus that you can see above ground. Their name club fungi comes from the Greek word for club, which is basidia, which is the name given to their reproductive structures that are found inside their caps. Now let's talk about the kingdom plantae, or plants, in the domain Eukarya. Because the kingdom plantae is in the domain Eukarya, that means that all of its cells are eukaryotic, meaning that they contain a nucleus and membrane-bound organelles. In the ecosystem, plants take on the role of producer. This is because they're autotrophic. They can make their own food through the process of photosynthesis, which means to make from light. Plants can take sunlight energy and create their own food source. You'll recall that this is the chemical equation for photosynthesis. In the presence of sunlight energy, carbon dioxide and water combine to create glucose and oxygen. This is a process that happens in the chloroplasts of plant cells. The carbon dioxide comes in and the oxygen comes out of the leaves through a process called transpiration, which means to breathe across. The water comes in from the roots and the glucose is often stored back in the roots. Transpiration happens through structures called stomata, which is a plural for stoma. It means little mouths. These are openings on the underside of the leaf that allow the passage of gases into and out of the plant. A waxy covering called a cuticle protects the leaves and stems from drying out. Some plants have a tissue called xylem that helps get water from the roots up into the rest of the plant. Some plants also have a structure called phloem that helps get the glucose that's made in the leaves down to be stored in the roots. Plants are not divided up into phyla as animals were. Rather, they're divided into 4 divisions based on structures they have or do not have. Here's a flowchart that will help you understand how plants are divided. Plants can either be non-vascular or vascular. Remember those tissues that I was talking about before, xylem and phloem, that help bring water up from the roots and take food made in the leaves down to the roots for storage? Vascular plants have those. Non-vascular plants, however, don't have those structures. Vascular tissue is a helpful adaptation because it allows a plant to grow taller and reach more sunlight and more water. Non-vascular plants that do not have vascular tissues include organisms such as moss. Moss is a very short, fuzzy plant that you might have seen growing on fallen logs or on rocks. Vascular plants can be further broken down into plants that have seeds and plants that don't. Some plants like ferns do not have seeds. They instead reproduce using spores. Plants with seeds can be further divided into gymnosperms, which means naked seed. These are organisms that have their seeds in cones rather than in fruits and flowers, or angiosperms, which are flowering plants. These are plants that have flowers or fruits. Angiosperms can be further broken down into monocots and dicots. Monocots are plants that when they grow only produce one sprout or seed leaf. Dicots produce branched sprouts or seed leaves. Some plants do asexual reproduction. This means that they use spores. The kinds of plants that do this are seedless non-vascular plants, such as mosses, and seedless vascular plants, such as ferns. These are some of the earliest plants to appear in the fossil record. Asexual reproduction is less complicated, evolutionarily speaking, than sexual reproduction. Plants can also do sexual reproduction, which means combining genetic material from 2 different organisms. Both gymnosperms and angiosperms do this kind of reproduction. Gymnosperms are also sometimes called conifers or coniferous plants or evergreens and include plants that have needles and have their seeds in cones. They also include a very old kind of plant called ginkgo. Angiosperms are what probably come to mind when you think of plants. These are plants that produce flowers or fruits when they grow. Flowers or fruits are created when a plant is pollinated, sometimes through the process of selective breeding if humans are involved, and the seed develops inside of a fruit or a flower. The distinction between monocot and dicot comes into play with the seed beginning to germinate. If a plant is a monocot, it will only have one seed leaf as it sprouts up through the ground. If a plant is a dicot, it will branch off into 2 seed leaves as it grows. Monocots and dicots, you'll recall, are categories of angiosperms, flowering plants. Another aspect of plants that we discussed was that of tropism. A tropism is a plant's response to its environment. 2 of the tropisms we discussed were phototropism and gravitropism. Phototropism is a plant's response to light. A plant will always grow towards the light source. No matter where the light source is, that's how the plant will grow. A gravitropism is a plant's response to gravity. Gravitropism is the reason why stems and leaves of plants always point up and the roots always point down. Sometimes humans can use phototropism and gravitropism to create cool topiary effects or make plants grow in interesting ways. If you've ever seen those spiral-shaped bamboo plants at the store, those are created using phototropisms. So now let's summarize all of this
really fast. Fungi and plants are both members of the domain eukarya, meaning that their cells contain nuclei and membrane-bound organelles. Both fungi and plants contain cells that have cell walls, though fungi were often miscategorized as plants. Both fungi and plants exhibit both kinds of reproduction, but it depends on the species. The reason why fungi cannot be categorized as plants is because fungi are heterotrophs and plants are autotrophs. Fungi typically take on the role of decomposers in the ecosystem, while plants are producers. Plants do the process called photosynthesis that takes sunlight energy, carbon dioxide, and water and creates glucose and oxygen. Fungi help recycle dead stuff and the nutrients that they contain back into the ecosystem. Fungi include imperfect fungi such as penicillium and the fungus that causes athlete's foot, sac fungi like truffles and yeast, club fungi, our most popular and famous fungi, and thread-like fungi such as bread mold. Plants include gymnosperms, which do not have flowers or fruits, angiosperms that produce flowers and fruits, seedless non-vascular plants such as mosses that do not grow very tall, and seedless vascular plants such as ferns that reproduce using spores. A quick rundown of the similarities and differences. Both plants and fungi are living things, eukaryotes with a nucleus and membrane-bound organelles. They display the 4 needs of life, the 5 levels of cellular organization, and the 6 characteristics of life. Both plants and fungi can sometimes asexually or sexually reproduce, and both have cell walls. Plants are autotrophic producers. They can be gymnosperms, angiosperms, vascular plants, non-vascular plants, monocots, and dicots. Some have xylem and phloem, and plants that have leaves have stomata and a cuticle. Plants perform photosynthesis. Fungi are heterotrophic decomposers. They can be thread-like, sac fungi, club fungi, imperfect fungi, or can include lichens. They have hyphae and mycelium, and their cell wall is made out of chitin.